Hello, I'm Andy Cochran from the Nass Mountain region. These two sections provide a more detailed picture of the balance sheet's strengths and weaknesses. It tells the story of their solvency or ability to satisfy debt obligations. Many of the current financial concerns in agriculture revolve around asset values and debt repayment, which comes from data in these sections. I'd like to share a chart with you from an ERS publication on historical comparisons of farm financial conditions. In the 1970s, farms borrowed heavily to expand production in response to rising commodity prices. Beginning in the early 1980s, higher interest rates and lower commodity prices led to an increase in farm bankruptcies. Farm real estate, which accounts for over 80% of farm sector asset values, fell by half between 1980 and 1987, adjusting for inflation. The high levels of farm debt combined with falling land values caused the debt-to-asset ratio to spike during the mid-1980s. The debt-to-asset ratio, which is total farm debt divided by total farm assets, is a measure of a farm's leverage and is used by lenders as an indicator of bankruptcy risk. Farms with high debt-to-asset ratio are generally more highly leveraged and have less ability to cover potential financial liabilities through the sale of assets, leading to a greater risk of default. The high debt-to-asset ratio in the mid-1980s indicates increased farm financial stress. Lower is better. The most recent data shows the debt-to-asset ratio is below the average level from 1970 to 2017, which you can see depicted by the bold dashed line, but is above the average in a more recent period since 2008, when we had a Great Recession. That average is shown by the skinny dashed line. FARMS data allows researchers to investigate how financial health varies across different farm types, because not every category faces the same challenges. This chart shows that hogs, poultry, and dairy operations carry more debt on average, and a higher share of those farms carry risky levels of debt, which is defined as more than 30% of their assets. The most recent period in this chart shows that risky debt levels are increasing as a share of those farm types. I wanted to share these charts with you just to illustrate how important it is to have comprehensive financial data representing all sizes and types of farms, so that researchers can measure who is at risk and shape better farm policy. In most of this survey, we emphasize our focus is on what they operate. But in this section, we're looking for assets which are on the operations books. Imagine the producer goes to the bank to apply for a loan, and the loan officer says, "What are your assets?" In section I, we record the fair market value of assets owned by the operation, even if it's land rented out. The section kicks off with the value of dwellings, but the producer's dwelling is distinguished from other dwellings the operation may own. We want to avoid duplicating any values that may be reported later as off-farm assets. The most common duplication we see is the producer's dwelling, so watch out for that. Moving down the page, land is perhaps the most valuable farm asset. Record the value of any land owned by the operation which is on their books, regardless of who is operating it. This should correspond with section A, where we asked for the acres they own. You may remember in section A, we recorded the value of land and buildings rented to others and rented from others. Here in section I, we look only at what they own and break it out into these various categories. Be careful not to double count the value of orchard trees or vines or nursery stock when recording land value in 1F. Those items are recorded separately in item 1D and can sometimes be worth even more than the ground itself. After cars and trucks, item 2B asks about tractors, machinery, tools, equipment, and implements owned by the operation. I'm reading all those out loud because I want you to remember this question isn't only about tractors. We often see none as a response, but I suspect nearly every farm has tools or some kind of equipment, even hobby farms. Be careful that you don't just say the first word, tractors, in your interview. Stock in the farm credit system will correlate with potential farm credit loans in the next section. Item 3 is unchanged from previous years, but I think it's often misunderstood. For each category, there are 2 columns, the asset value at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year. The difference between them is related to both quantity and value changes. There's a tendency to report the same number at year's beginning and end, especially when producers say it's the same. But even when the quantity is the same, values continually change. When respondents say the same number at the end and the beginning of the year, ask if they mean that it's the same quantity, and then probe if the value has gone up or down since January 1st. Another common potential issue we see is when only one column is filled out. Sometimes this is appropriate, if they carried over something in one year but not the other, for example. But non-response to one column or the other could have dramatic consequences at representing the farm's financial health, because the difference between end-of-year asset values and beginning-of-year asset values is part of the net farm income calculation. Keep in mind, when commodities are still on hand at the end of the year, then you should probably have some unsold production in section B or C. And likewise, if they carried over crops or livestock from the previous year, you should probably have some sales without production in section B or C. Let's look at the categories in item 3. Were crops sold in a different year than they were harvested? Did they have grain stocks on hand? If it's a livestock operation, did they have hay or other feed products on hand? Did the operator purchase seed, fertilizer, or chemicals in the fall that were not going to be used until next spring? These are all situations where you should record asset values of these items, which are on hand either at the beginning or end of the year, or both. Item 3B relates to breeding livestock, which they reported in section C. Dairy cows are included with breeding livestock, along with any animals kept for breeding purposes. Horses are often overlooked, but also calves or other livestock not used for breeding purposes would belong in item 3C. Why does it say located on or off this operation? Because we don't want to exclude livestock that are grazing on public land or private AUM leases, for example, just because they're not technically on operated land. To be clear, you should include the asset value of livestock which they own and operate. Can you think of an example of livestock owned by this operation that do not belong here? Large dairy, hog, and poultry operations might have livestock being raised by others, which would be reported under section D and excluded here. It is common for farms to have fuel on hand or to carry over fertilizers, chemicals, and seed, or other supplies from one year to the next. The value of those production inputs not used up during the year belongs in 3D. There might be some clues in the expenses section that relate to these values. If you're interviewing a crop farm and they didn't spend very much on seed or fertilizer, you might expect they carried over those production inputs from the prior year. Then you should expect to see a larger asset value in the beginning of your column for 3D. On the other hand, maybe they reported an unusually high expense for fuel. Then you would expect a relatively large end-of-year asset value for 3D. I get a lot of questions about 3E because maybe it isn't so intuitive what goes here. It's similar to item 3D, but for inputs that have already been used to grow commodities that have not yet reached maturity. Think about a farmer who has planted winter wheat in the fall. The crop in the ground has value at the end of the year, even though it hasn't been harvested yet, because the farmer has used seed, fertilizer, chemicals, fuel, and other inputs to get it to that stage. Similarly, think of a farmer who raises livestock under a production contract. Until he is paid for his services when the animals reach maturity, item 3E represents the value of inputs used for production. Lastly, item 4 is for liquid assets. This is a pretty loaded question, so take a look at all the possibilities included here. I understand this is often a refused question, so please indicate with notes if that is the case, rather than just marking none when no answer is given. Nearly everyone has some liquid assets, even if they are financially struggling or in debt. Let's go through an example with a fictional target producer, Mrs. Jones. Her home is part of the operations books and is worth about $200,000. Record that here, and be careful not to duplicate it later as an off-farm asset. There are no other dwellings on the operation. The buildings and corrals are worth about $60,000. These structures are sometimes overlooked and they belong in 1C. She owns land worth $1 million. She doesn't have any orchard or nursery stock, and she doesn't know the value of her mineral rights. I'll put DK next to the box. On paper, it's a good general rule to avoid writing in the data cells unless it's strictly necessary for clarity. If you're doing this on your iPad, use the calculator tool to enter DK. Mrs. Jones also rents some land from her neighbor worth about $300,000. That is a red herring in this example because it doesn't belong here. We actually record the value of land rented from others back in section A. She also rented out a few acres worth $100,000. Think about that for a second. Should we subtract $100,000 from the $1 million for question 1F? Actually, no. It says to include land rented to others. Remember what I said a minute ago. These questions represent what they own and not necessarily what they operate. Record $1 million. And please avoid writing the word million, and just write out the number. Also, your region may prefer you avoid using commas on the questionnaire, as they sometimes confuse the keyers. We wouldn't want them to be keyed as a 1, so leave a little space where a comma would be. Mrs. Jones owns 3 pickup trucks worth $70,000 and a car worth $13,000. The value of cars and trucks are combined in question 2A. She rents tractors and implements and doesn't own any. She does own about $5,000 of tools on the farm. Remember not to overlook tools. 2B is not just for tractors. And she has $11,000 in stock in the farm credit system where she has a loan. Operations with farm credit loans in the next section should have some stock value here in 2C. Mrs. Jones carried over $250,000 of unsold wheat from last year in grain bins. Record that in the beginning of year column. Keep in mind, she likely sold that wheat during the year, so you should expect to also record sales in section B in the cash sales from any year's production. This year, she carried over much less of her wheat crop, having sold all but $40,000 by the end of the year. Record that in the end of year column. This also relates back to section B, where she would have recorded harvesting this unsold wheat. We sometimes see enumerators duplicate crops on hand with accounts receivable. We need to avoid that duplication. If the commodity has been sold, but the operator hasn't been paid yet, then we want to record that under accounts receivable in section F and not record anything in section I because that crop isn't an asset to the operation anymore. On the other hand, if the commodity had not been sold, say for example a crop that is being stored at a commercial elevator to be sold at a later date, then we would want to include its value in section I and not record anything in section F. Moving on, Mrs. Jones didn't breed any livestock, but has a few horses worth about $10,000 and figures they were worth $1,000 more at the start of the year. This is one of those situations where a respondent likely will say it's the same, and you may have to probe for the change in value. Mrs. Jones stocked up on fuel and fertilizer this year with $60,000 worth of inputs on hand at the end, compared to just $20,000 at the beginning of the year. The ending value is much higher than the beginning value. By itself, this difference would contribute to higher net farm income. But she didn't just end up with more inputs. She paid for them. There should be corresponding expenses for those inputs in the expenses section. You can see how the change in asset value for inventory on hand is an important piece of the puzzle, just like sales and expenses, to complete the calculation of net farm income and tell the story of their farm's financial health. Finally, I didn't mention liquid assets in the example. Don't forget to ask this question at the bottom of the page, which should almost always be a positive value. To recap section I, we want to include assets owned by the operation. In other words, the assets on their books. Account for everything, but also avoid duplication, especially the producer's dwelling. Record their dwelling either on farm or off farm, but not both. By this point, you know a good deal about the operation you're interviewing. Use those clues to look for relationships between earlier data and the corresponding asset values. For example, did they report owning land in section A? Look for the asset value of that land. Did they report repairs for buildings or for equipment? Look for corresponding asset values. Did they report owning livestock in section C? Look for livestock asset values and probably some feed on hand. Most farms will have vehicles, tools, equipment, and liquid assets. Familiarize yourself with the questionnaire so that you are prepared to recognize these data relationships.
Double count assets. Oh, don't double count assets. Don't double count assets. Don't double count assets. Oh, 30. Oh, I'm done. Oh. Oh. You know, watching Andy, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd report the value of this bag of feed I've had since fall in the assets section. Whew. And you had this at the end of the year, yeah? Yeah, I've had this at the end of the year. Well, that would appear as an end-of-year asset. If the respondent doesn't know what it was worth, an approximate quantity would be helpful. Oh, that's a good point, Franz. I sold some of my crop in December as part of a cash sale and received payment then and there. Oh, $40 crop. Good job. Where would that be reported? Oh, so the cash would appear in section B, and then the money in your hands sounds like it would be in the farm operators. The money in your hands would be in the farm operations, and if that's the case, then it would be section I, item 4, liquid assets, because it's money on hand. Whew. Okay. Yeah, that was pretty rough, but I guess I should go back to lifting more weights.
Hey, that's great insight. If you guys are ever in the neighborhood, maybe we can work on our arms together. I've got dumbbells and questionnaires. Okay, now we're going to switch gears to the debt section. These data are used to represent farm sector debt, where the funds come from, and how it relates to the whole farm financial picture. This chart shows farm debt is rising in recent years, and in particular, the real estate portion shown in orange is increasing. Non-real estate debt in green has been more or less the same. This chart from ERS relies on data from the debt section, and particularly the distinction made in column 5, where we ask for the loan type. Commercial banks and the farm credit system are the biggest lenders in agriculture, together representing over 80% of farm loans. These are shown on the chart in dark blue and red lines, respectively. Over the 20 years represented here, farm credit loans have grown to a larger percentage of farm sector debt, while loans from individuals and other sources have declined. This ERS chart also relies on ARMS data, particularly from column 1 in the debt table, where we identify lenders using codes above the table. If the producer needed to borrow money, we want to represent their debt during the reference year. The table in item 3 is only for loans which have an outstanding balance at the end of the year. But what if they took out an operating loan during the year and repaid it already? That's what item 2 is meant for. Loans that were both taken out and repaid during the reference year belong in item 2. Both of these conditions must be met. One common issue I see is when enumerators sum all of the year's loan payments into question 2. If the money was borrowed in an earlier year, or if it wasn't repaid during the reference year, then it does not belong in item 2. As I mentioned, item 3 is for loans with an outstanding balance as of December 31st. This could be any type of loan, as long as it is on the farm's books. Be careful not to duplicate loans with any off-farm debt. For example, if the producer's dwelling is an on-farm asset, then an associated mortgage should be on-farm debt. Conversely, if their dwelling was an off-farm asset, then the mortgage would be recorded later as an off-farm debt. Use the codes above the table to complete columns 1 and 5, referring to the lender and the loan type. Remember, column 3 must be positive because that represents the end-of-year loan balance. If there was no outstanding balance, then it does not belong in this table. In column 4, record the interest rate in hundredths of a percent. Notice the decimal place separates 2 white spaces. If the operator gives you a whole number interest rate, like 5%, make sure you put the number 5 to the left of the decimal and the 2 zeros to the right of the decimal. If you mistakenly put the 5 to the right, it will be keyed as 0.05%. There are instances where farmers have 0% interest loans, particularly for equipment or personal loans from individuals. When that is the case, leave a comment so we know the interest rate was 0 and not just refused. There are a couple of trouble spots worth mentioning here. When a loan is refinanced, the original loan is concluded and does not belong here. So in columns 6 and 7, where it asks for the year obtained and the original term of the loan, that refers to the year and the original term of the current loan or the refinanced loan. Column 8 gives enumerators trouble as well. The wording was simplified recently, but it can still be a bit confusing. Essentially, we're looking for the percentage of the loan that is for this farm operation. It's possible that the producer has multiple operations that share farmland or equipment. What portion of the loan is for this operation? Where I think enumerators are sometimes confused is for things like the producer's house. I often see 0 in column 8, which is technically never correct. If 0% was for this operation, then it would not belong in this section to begin with. If the producer's house was on the farm's books and was recorded as a farm asset, then a mortgage for that house should be 100% an expense for this farm operation in column 8. The debt table has space for 5 loans, but what if they have more than 5? If possible, I recommend that you record their 5 largest loans first. Then, for any additional loans, add up the end-of-year loan balances and record them in question 4. This is not a sum total of all their loans. Question 4 is only for the loans not already listed in the table. It should only be completed when they reported 5 loans in the table and couldn't fit their additional loans. Let's continue our example with Mrs. Jones, who has a 1-year operating loan through the farm credit system. She borrowed $100,000 during the year to cover her seed and fertilizer expenses. By December 31st, she had paid back $70,000. The interest rate was 6.25%. Remember, question 2 is for money borrowed and repaid during the year. Mrs. Jones took out and repaid $70,000 during the year. There is still an outstanding balance at the end of the year, so continue with question 3. The lender was Farm Credit System, so use code 1 in the first column. There was no balance on January 1st, and the ending balance was $30,000. The interest rate was 6.25%, and use code 1 in column 5 to correspond with the 1 year or less production loan. The loan was obtained during the reference year. The original term is 1 year for this loan type, and we'll assume in my fictional example that it was all used for this operation. Mrs. Jones also borrowed a 30-year mortgage for her house in 2007. Then she refinanced the loan in 2018 to a 15-year mortgage at 3.75% interest with a commercial bank. I won't go through each of the columns this time, but pay attention to columns 6 and 7. The year obtained is 2018, and original term is 15. When the loan was refinanced, the previous loan no longer exists. The current loan began in 2018. And in column 8, you should record 100% because she indicated in the assets section that her dwelling was on the operations books. Many farmers use assets as security for loans for a variety of purposes. These data are used to help establish who is providing funds to meet farmers' borrowing needs. As a reminder, we want to avoid duplicating on-farm debt reported here with off-farm debt reported later in the questionnaire. And be mindful of data relationships. In particular, farms with debt should probably have an interest expense. And those who reported farm credit stock as an asset may have a farm credit loan. Assets and debt make up just a few pages of the questionnaire, but play a vital part in the story of farm financial health. Data from these sections will help researchers to take the pulse of farm solvency and find solutions to prevent bankruptcy in the farm sector.